You're plugged in with your host, Malachi Malay, where real-life issues meet real-life solutions. No matter what real life throws at you, remember, you are not the only one. You are not alone. Pick yourself up, look that issue in the eye, and tell it, "You will not defeat me."
Ladies and gentlemen, it's your host, Malachi Malay, with the Walking Purpose Show. Now today, we have a topic. The topic's about homelessness, So we're going to tackle this issue. We're going to tackle the stereotypes. We're going to tackle the facts and the made-up stuff. You know what I mean? So I ain't in the studio today. So I decided to go outside in the street and do this thing for real. So without further delay, here we go.
I was homeless from 1978 till the year 2001. 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, all my 20s, all my 30s, and right up until I was 38 years old, 39 years old, I was a homeless man. You learn to be a loner. You learn to have a few close friends and a few places to hide. A lot of times I disappeared from off the streets, from society, and I found my places where nobody knew or could find me. I didn't like people, and people didn't like me because I wasn't a nice guy. I learned quickly how to be a homeless man, and that was to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut. The more I knew, the less I said. Homelessness is not something it's something that's so misunderstood by society, because I hear people say, well, they want to be on the streets. But 80% of the people that live on the streets suffer from some sort of mental disorder, including addictions. When you have to survive on the streets, the only thing you can do to stay sane, as much as sane can be, is to do drugs. There are junkies, there are crackheads, there are coke addicts, there are potheads, and the whole mix of kind of alcoholics. There's the alcoholics that drink the Lysol, there's the alcoholics that drink the wine, there's the alcoholics that drink the hard liquor, then there's the guys that just drink the beer. That whole mix of people, mixed in with criminals that are hiding, criminals and people that are disappearing, people that are just getting out of prison, people that are, it's just a whole mix of people. In that I learned to survive. I traveled, let me see, I've been to approximately 70 different cities in the community. I slept under bridges, I slept in ditches, I slept in shelters. Homelessness is hell. Homelessness is hell. It's really misunderstood. The national government, the Canadian government, wrote a report called Homelessness, the National Disaster. In that report, they said that they didn't know how to define what it means to be homeless and who the homeless were, and they didn't know how to or properly count the homeless. I estimate somewhere between 250 and 500,000 people live on the streets of Canada. That's winter, summer, spring, and fall. That's either in a shelter, sleeping on somebody's couch, in an institution, or sleeping directly on the streets themselves. Homelessness for me became a lifestyle. I would go into a city, any city, doesn't matter to me. Cities change in size and in location, but in every city there's a group of people that everybody doesn't want to admit exists, and that's the homeless. And I lived on so many inner cities, I can find myself in any city and survive in that city. It doesn't really matter. 25 years is a long time. If you consider 25 years as a prison sentence, it's over 9,000 days. And for over 9,000 days, I lived as a homeless man. Did I like it? At times I did. I could go where I wanted, be where I wanted. I became accustomed to it. I became marginalized, and I became, what do they call it? Disassociated, disenfranchised, and marginalized by society. You ask for money, you pan for change, you get used to people mouthing you off, you get used to people saying no, you get used to governments treating you like you're a second-class citizen. Housing is a huge problem. There's a lot of people ending up on the streets because of lack of housing. Mental institutions are being emptied out, and people are being let out of mental institutions and they can't care for themselves properly, so you've got a lot of people with schizophrenic problems ending up on the streets. You see guys get beat with baseball bats, you get guys get beat, bricks across the side of the head. You watch guys get bottles smashed over their head, cups in their face, glass cups in their face. Fights start because somebody steps in line, in a food line, too fast. But then you find there's a group of people, homelessness, what made it so good, if that can be said, so good, was when you became a part of a homeless community. Every community has their homeless, and there's a tight-knit group of people. If you're known as a homeless person in that street by the other homeless people, that tight-knit group works together. There are some that are on the outside, there are some that aren't in the part of this group, but people group off and group together. And you survive that way. I'd figure out how I was going to get my next meal, where I was going to get my next meal from, if I was going to sleep in the shelter that night or if I was going to sleep outside, who was after me, who was mad at me, who I was mad at, who had a beef with who, what kind of trouble was going on in the street. You know, one time, for being a homeless man, I walked into a mall in a certain city somewhere between the North Pole and the South Pole. I walked into the mall of that city and somebody said, well, that's Dan Cullen. And the police and the security guards walked over to me because I was a homeless man, asked me for my ID, and I showed them my ID. I hadn't been in this city for years, never been into that mall or been kicked out of that mall. But they told me I was barred from that mall. I said, well then give me, I don't know what I'm barred for, but I said, give me back my ID, I'll leave the mall. And they said, you can't do that, you're under arrest. They arrested me. They put me on handcuffs and arrested me. They thought I was a homeless man and they could get away with doing stuff like this, right? But it was that kind of treatment because you were homeless, because you looked like a homeless person. I mean, I remember standing on street corners. One lady looked at me and said, Mommy, who is that man? And her response was, nobody, dear, he's a homeless man. I wrote a poem somewhere called My Name is Nobody. She pointed at that little girl and said I was nobody because I was a homeless man. She looked at me and she said, he's a homeless man, dear, don't worry about him. The smell that you get used to in the shelters, there's a certain smell that you can never appreciate unless you've been in a room with 50 other men who have taken their shoes off and they haven't had a bath in 2 weeks and their feet. They haven't had a bath in 2 weeks and their feet stink. And they're passing gas and burping and they're dirty and they're sweaty and they're smelly. That was home for me. Sometimes it was even better just to find yourself under a bridge, somewhere like this. Roll up with your back against the wall, sit there, fall asleep, maybe roll over on the floor, on the ground. It was life. It was life. There's a lot more can be said about homelessness. I'll say it a lot more later. That's enough. By the time I was 39 years old, I had gained a reputation on the streets. People on the streets called me Merlin, M-Y-R-L-I-N. That was my nickname. I wore the name with pride. I'd gained respect with that name of the people on the streets. Wherever, some people probably didn't like me, but that's all right. I probably didn't like them either. But 95% of the people I knew that knew me as Merlin, I had gained some respect. I'd done some things. I was in a town, Kelowna to be exact, British Columbia, the very town I left home at when I was 16 years old. Is that ever ironic? And it was November of 2001. I was sleeping with a pack of people. There was a pack of us walked together. I was sleeping behind a wall in November. Yeah, I had a sleeping bag, and that's where I pitched my tent at night, or pitched myself at night. And it was there. I'd get up in the day, cold as you don't know cold is until you've slept outside in the wintertime on the ground without a bed, without a mattress or anything. I went from there. I'd get up in the morning, I'd go into a drop-in center, and I'd sit there most of the day. I knew a lot of people. Anyways, that was the start of the end of me being on the streets. Sleeping in the cold. What a way. 38 years old, 39 years old. Yeah, I think I was 38. Sleeping in the cold, marching around with a bunch of other homeless people through a city. Anyways, these guys, there was a shelter in that town that just, I have always had a beef with that shelter. They've always had a beef with me. We had a disagreement that I didn't like their style of doing things, and they didn't like my style. I was kicked out of the mission for reasons. I was practicing, I was reading tarot cards in the shelter, and it was a Christian mission, so they didn't like that very much. And I went to, I was out, one of my friends was out, so they made a squat. They made a pitch to some tents, and they said, we call it Camp Freedom. We want you to come in with us. I said, sure. So I went in with them, and me just joining these people, all of a sudden I became the mouthpiece or the spokesperson for these people, for my friends. There was Raven, there was Medusa, there was a guy by the name of Pumbaa, Scott, there was, I can't remember the other guy's name, but there were several others that joined us. And we decided that we were going to make a stand. We were on city property, that we called the newspapers, we got the media involved. Then the city got involved, and they huffed and they hollered, and they were making a mess. They came in one night, early one morning actually, after we'd been there for about 7 days, 8 days, making noise, and they pulled us out the police that night pulled me, in November, pulled me out of my tent in my sock feet. And they pulled everybody else out. They took us to jail. They threw all our stuff up, and they put us in jail. They sent me out of jail that night, that day, a couple hours later, in my sock feet in November. I was furious. I was screaming and yelling at this cop. He was big too. Thank God there was a superior officer there with him that held him back, because he was starting to make a walk for me. He was coming at me to get me. Anyways, they let us go. That was it. The next day we went to City Hall. They had security guards out there like you wouldn't believe at City Hall. And we started to make noise, and I made a promise that I was going to get a shelter open in that town. I made a boast. I said, just watch, I'll get a shelter open. That was in November. I think it was in February of 2002 that there was a shelter open for the homeless in Kelowna, BC, and out of the cold shelter. And the beds were used 800 times in the first 52 days. 800 or 500, something like that. A lot of bed uses in the first 52 days, which showed that there was an obvious need. And when I did that, that was the first time I did something productive for society that was for the well-being of everybody else. And I decided that maybe it was time for me to get off the street. That was a long way to go. I had a long way to go. But that was the beginning of the end. As Camp Freedom became my Camp Freedom. It was the thing that the light went on. There was a time I was on 3,000 milligrams of medication. That's another story for another time. But I was on 3,000 milligrams of medication, 1,500 milligrams of lithium, 250 milligrams of trazodone, 60 milligrams of Paxil, 2.5 milligrams of clonazepam, and 900 milligrams of Dilantin. Every day I took those pills. Every day. I had them with me, and I took them. I had to. I was court-ordered to take them. But I stopped taking the medications, and I started to work a principle that I had built over the years. Because as a homeless man, here, I'm going on now, but just as a homeless man, in the wintertime, you don't want to be outside all the time, right? So I learned early on, about 17, how to sit in libraries. And you can't just sit in a library and do nothing, or they'll kick your tail out. So I learned to study. I learned to read. I started reading philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, metaphysics, occult, and theology. For 25 years, every winter and summer, I'd be in libraries just combing the shelves on those 7 subjects. And because of that, I had a good understanding of psychology, and I took my understanding of psychology and my idea and put it to work. I quit the medication and I put the plan to work, and I worked my way back. I started marching my way back from insanity and homelessness, and I'm off the streets now since 2002, off medication since 2002, doing all that stuff. How are you? And that's pretty much it.
Now, the real question is that what you do, you know, what do you do when you encounter homeless people? Do you give them money? You know, do you give them food? You know, what? Like, do you try to help them out? But the truth is that there isn't really any one answer, you know. It all depends on what the circumstances is and what you feel, you know, in your heart to do. And what I hope is that you feel some type of remorse, some type of empathy in order to, you know, to help out your fellow individuals, you know, because that's what it is. You know, anybody right now that's living paycheck to paycheck, which is probably half of the population right now, anybody that's living paycheck to paycheck, that doesn't really have, you know, a family or a savings plan or several $1,000s in the bank just to hold them down. What happens if you lose your job and you're living paycheck to paycheck? You know, that same homeless person that you might look down on, or you may not have any understanding for, that could be you. You know what I mean? And what do? You know, if you lose your job, you ain't got a family to hold you down. You know, you ain't got nowhere to go. You're pretty much homeless. You know, so I just want everybody to remember that next time they pass a homeless person, every single time you see a homeless person, just understand that any given day, that could be you.
I'm Spurgeon Wynn, and when I think about homeless people, I usually imagine somebody who has an addiction problem with either drugs or alcohol, or I think of somebody who, you know, is mentally handicapped, or who isn't in their right, you know, state of mind, and they don't get the help they need from the government, so you know, they're forced to live on the street.
It's Jonathan Brown from the Toronto Argonauts, defensive end, Tulsa, Oklahoma. My opinion on homelessness is I cannot believe how a person could be homeless and not have nowhere to go, nowhere to stay, nowhere to sleep, no family member to call, to go stay with or either get help with. It's a brutal thing, and I can't believe it's in the world.